So what's been going on, Eric? So I think I saw that you just recently came back from Canada. Is that correct?
The UK. I was coaching for Canada,
Oh,
so
so that meet was in the UK.
yeah, it was Sheffield,
Cool,
which
cool.
is yeah, and it was the comp was the Sheffield.
Okay,
So,
is
yeah,
that like a major world like powerlifting competition or something like that?
it is, and it's the inaugural event. It was initially planned in 2020, and the whole idea was they were going to get together the best of the best, 12 women and 12 men from the IPF to battle head to head across weight classes with prize money for world records.
Wow,
Got delayed because of COVID, and now it finally happened. And it's actually the biggest meet in powerlifting history to date. There
that's
was
huge.
nearly 2,000 people in attendance in Sheffield City Hall. It was like being on stage at a rock concert, not a powerlifting meet. It was wild.
Yeah, that's rad, and that's kind of what you want from like a powerlifting meet. You kind of want that huge like atmosphere, and you want the crowd going for it. And yeah, it sounds like that would have been an amazing thing to witness. I think I even saw on Omar's post something about like one of the dudes totaled like the most someone ever has. Is that like in his weight class?
No, just period.
Oh,
Because Jesus Olivar is a super heavyweight, so
yeah.
he's in the 120 plus category.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was both in his weight class, but also the people in the men's super heavyweight division totaled
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
than everybody else typically.
Yeah.
So no, that was a historic performance. He's a drug tested raw power lifter, and he actually beat the untested raw record in addition
Wow.
to the raw record, which is held by none other than Ray Williams, who
Right.
people
Right.
thought
Okay.
would
Yeah.
never be topped. He was so far ahead of his competition. So to have someone above that now, additionally, Jesus is 24, I think, which is just pretty wild because
It's
Ray hit his
insane.
peak like late 20s, early 30s. Not that he's gone yet, but it was nuts.
Yeah.
It was the most impressive performance in powerlifting history.
Yeah, that's nuts. And do we have some Kiwis over there lifting as well?
We did, yes. So actually, on the women's side, Evie Corrigan won the whole thing.
Oh,
Um,
insane.
yes, she did a great job, and yeah, she broke the world record by a substantial margin in the 52 kilo division, and she successfully moved down a weight class from she was slotted as a 57, she went to 52, and preserved most of her strength. It was a calculated gamble that heavily paid off.
Yeah.
And then there was also Carlina Tongotia, who is a rising star in the 76s, who I was actually coaching against because my athlete, Jessica Bittner, is from Canada, and she is the current and the reigning 76 kilo world champion. And now Carlina is coming out of the woodworks
Yeah.
to show that she is a legitimate challenger, and they had a good scrap, um, and we'll find out who is actually able to win head to head when they battle in Malta, which is June for Worlds.
Oh, cool. I guess it's kind of making, well, I mean, I don't really follow powerlifting like, to a large degree. I kind of just see what you guys put up, but it kind of makes it like quite an exciting sport to start paying attention to when you have these like huge events and like these kind of back and forth battles where people are, like rising stars, like you said, and then there's these people that just come out of the woodworks and just crush things, and it does make it really exciting. I guess that's probably due to like just a larger talent pool of lifters now, like in terms of more people getting into it. Would you say that's true, or
Definitely, probably the biggest piece of it is that there is now a
yeah,
sufficient number of people participating to where you're starting to see those outliers, um, then there being multiple outliers who are now battling. And also, a big shout out to like the SBD, which is the company you've probably seen the sleeves and the belts that they do. They made the Sheffield happen, so big shout out to them. And I think it was obviously years of thousands of people in the community getting to the point where the Sheffield could even happen for the Sheffield for the SBD to really capitalize on that and be like, hey, let's put this event together. But the culmination was exactly what you're saying. We're now at a point. I used to be very skeptical of this, that powerlifting could become a spectator sport rather than it's just only powerlifters watching other powerlifters
yeah,
or their families. But now we're actually seeing people who are like general lifting and strength enthusiasts who are interested in watching this. And that's typically only something that other disciplines in the iron game have been able to do, like strongman, strongman probably most
Yeah.
notably.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a little easier, when someone's pulling a truck, to be interested in
Yeah.
watching.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then CrossFit, I think there's a lot of people who like to watch the CrossFit Games, and it's a little more dynamic than
Mm.
powerlifting because it's a different event every single time, and there's all these different domains of fitness. But let's be honest, doing reps on an exercise, like, people don't go, "Hey, do you want to go down to the local gym and watch people work out?"
Yeah,
You
watch
know.
that guy bench. Yeah.
So I think that actually speaks to the shrewdness of the community in the CrossFit community on knowing how to market themselves
Yeah.
and make the events really engaging and highlight those battles. And I think we're soon to be getting. There's the first taste of that in the powerlifting community, I guess I could say.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And are you gearing up for any meets yourself? Because I know that you've done a bunch of powerlifting meets in the last couple of years. Is this what's going on for you this year, or what's the plan?
Yeah, good question. So I am turning 40 this year.
Wow,
Um,
epic.
in literally just, what day is today? The 5th. In 17 days,
All
I will
right.
be an old man and
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
downswing.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'll be a Masters 1 competitor. And I was also planning on this year, when I turn 40, to compete in bodybuilding again. So I normally compete in the 93 kilo weight class, and I'm, only competitive at like the local level.
You're right.
But in the 83 kilo division, which I'm going to get that lean anyway for bodybuilding,
Yeah.
depending on how much strength I preserve, I move from being like mediocre to slightly above average.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all of a sudden, I've got a shot where I can do better. And then if you go, okay, from the 83s, but then if I compete as an M1, a Masters 1,
Yeah.
now I go from being mediocre to slightly above average.
There
So
you
like,
go.
hey, not bad.
Just stroking the
So
ego a little bit as you get older.
that's right. It's just got to survive and beat. And I just win by attrition. Everyone else no
That's
longer
right. Everyone else
lives.
falls off. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I mean, I guess that is beautiful because it segues really nicely into the conversation we want to have today, around this idea of like how, you're, I guess, structuring these two potentially, like in some people's eyes, mutually exclusive goals. Like you're doing powerlifting on one hand, but then you're doing bodybuilding on another hand, and now you're wanting to compete at this lower weight, which means generally, like, I think for most people, including myself, in a fat loss phase, feel like you're losing a bunch of strength. And as you mentioned, it's a case of like how much of that strength can you preserve to be able to do this powerlifting meet probably in the middle of a bodybuilding prep, which that can be quite the challenge. But I guess from your perspective, how do those two things, I guess, is there in your eyes like massive differences between the two, or can you kind of structure them in the same way so that you can get the most of both worlds? I guess just as a general overview before we sort of dive deeper into it.
Absolutely. And Jackson, I think this is an angle where I can tackle this from my personal experience and coaching experience, logistics of how do you do this, because I work with a lot of strength athletes who are also physique athletes or vice versa, some who prioritize one over the other, or some people like me who see both as equally important goals. I can also tackle this from the amateur historical perspective. Kind of if we look at the history of strength sport and the iron game compared to what it is today, the perspectives were very different. And people were achieving things that today, some of the people you alluded to who think that it's not possible would be very surprised by, and that it was normal. And then finally, we could talk about the science, like what is strength, and how do we define it? What are the contributing factors? And we can see the overlap there. So that's kind of the directions we could go, and I'll let you lead us where you want to take it. But I will say they are complementary adaptations at the very least. Strength is not the same thing as powerlifting necessarily, and hypertrophy is not the same thing as bodybuilding necessarily. But there are many examples of people who successfully do both. It's certainly not the norm, and you can do them both very well at a high level. It just takes some thought and some planning.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think, for probably the majority of the listeners to this podcast, like, they're not going to be competitive bodybuilders or powerlifters. But I think, there is, like you alluded to, there's some overlap there between, it's training for bodybuilding is generally training for hypertrophy, and powerlifting is generally training for strength. But maybe we could start, Eric, and I'd love to circle back to some of that, the historical context of the stuff. But maybe we can actually start by definitions, like actually defining like what is strength, and then what would you, I guess, how would you describe hypertrophy?
Absolutely. So we'll start with hypertrophy because it's probably a little easier, and that the word hypertrophy is just the opposite of atrophy. So we have kind of those prefixes a, or we have the prefix hyper. Like we have hypertension or hypotension, a or the lack of. So atrophy just means the loss of muscle tissue, the shrinking of a muscle, and then hypertrophy just means the growth of it. And you can measure hypertrophy multiple different levels depending on the measurement device. So in like applied exercise science, which I do a lot of, one of the most common devices we'll use is an ultrasound unit. And you're thinking, oh, this is how you find out whether the pregnant woman's child is one sex or the other, or healthy. But being able to just send sound waves and have them bounce back and at different echo intensities and different tissue, you can get an image, and then you can just measure muscle thickness. So when we actually do studies here at AUT on changes in body composition, typically the two metrics we're getting is changes in ultrasound muscle thickness at specific sites, and then also skin fold thicknesses, so we can get an idea of the composition of the change. That's the highest level. That's a whole muscle change, and there's other ways to measure it as well. If you have a panoramic image from an ultrasound, you can get the cross-sectional area. So that's when you actually look at the cross-section of the image and you calculate the area of a muscle and how it changes over time. And that is a pretty strong relationship with thickness. You can also do that with the quote-unquote gold standard device, an MRI, which are harder to come by, more expensive. So ultrasound are a little easier to use, less constraints on what you need to actually fit into, et cetera. At a less specific site than that, there is body composition measurements, like say doing a dunk tank 2-compartment model, or your DEXA scan, which is a 3-compartment model that adds in bone density, or even combining multiple different measurements to do different body composition measurements. And then you're not looking at necessarily hypertrophy directly, but you're looking at lean mass, which is good and it can tell you a lot. But lean mass also includes a lot of things that are not skeletal muscle: organ tissue, connective tissue, bone mass, obviously, things like that. And when you look at research, those are the most common ones, but you can even go down to a finer level. So you can look at fiber-specific hypertrophy, where you actually take a biopsy and then you look to see if the specific muscle fibers themselves have increased in diameter. And then you can see, okay, were certain types of muscle fibers increasing in diameter to more or less of a degree, and you can get more fine-tuned understanding of the adaptation that you're incurring. So that's hypertrophy is muscle growth, very simply. But with more complexity, you can start looking at different levels. And sometimes, really interestingly, they don't always line up. Like you might not see a change in whole muscle size, muscle thickness or cross-sectional area, but you see certain fibers hypertrophying in certain areas. Then the question is, okay, well, did we just sample a region that was growing even though the whole muscle didn't grow collectively enough for us to measure it? Or are we seeing fiber type specific growth? So there's value in all these measurements. Probably the most relevant one to your casual listener who's just trying to look more jacked is the whole muscle changes, something like a ultrasound derived muscle thickness measurement.
Yeah. Now,
strength is a performance outcome, right? If we wanted to measure strength, there's various ways to do this. Strength in strength sport is not only a quality of the body, but also a skill. So you can take someone who is just quote unquote very strong in a general sense, who's never squatted before in their life, and someone far weaker than them may be able to do a greater squat 1RM because they know how to squat. They're a skilled squatter, right? An even easier way to demonstrate this is if you take the strongest squatter in the world and they try to do a snatch, they wouldn't have the same relationship between their squat 1RM and their snatch 1RM that an Olympic lifter who does both regularly would.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So strength is very movement specific. If you want to go into a lab and get a more quote unquote general strength score, then what you need to do is remove the skill element to the greatest degree you can. And there's various ways of doing that, from rather low tech to high tech. On the low tech side would be something like a hand grip strength dynamometer. You're just squeezing a dynamometer and it's just giving you a peak force value in newtons. So that's just how strong is your hand grip strength. And that tends to correlate to other values of strength. If you want to get more joint specific, or even joint angle specific, we have what's called isokinetic dynamometry. So this is a machine where you can set it up to be either isometric, meaning the joint angle doesn't change. It's a fixed thing you're pushing your foot against to measure knee extension strength or knee flexion strength, or elbow flexor or extensor strength. Or you can have it move. Isokinetic means at one speed. So no matter how hard you push against it, it'll only move at a certain number of degrees per second. And then you can get a torque, which is just the force about a joint value at a speed for a given joint, concentrically or eccentrically. And it's a machine, so it's a fixed movement path. Somewhere in between, your isokinetic dynamometer and your hand grip strength would be something like a mid-thigh pull. And this is just where you set an immovable bar at about the mid-thigh. And then you're standing on a force plate, or you have a strain gauge attached to a chain, and the bar is set up at mid-thigh. So you can pull as hard as you want. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's getting kind of this aggregate strength that has a very strong correlation with your maximum deadlift, understandably, or squat. But there's not a whole lot of skill involved. You can go in and give someone one familiarization session, and they're probably going to be able to maximize their strength output on that given movement. So generally, that's how we would define strength. Maximal strength is your ability to express maximal force on a given movement or task, and hypertrophy is an increase in muscle size.
Yeah, so with that strength component, it's kind of like, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a combination between, like, I guess for the practical application of lifting, it's a combination between a muscle's ability to produce a certain amount of force and then, I guess, the skill of actually being able to do the lift efficiently.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we wanted to create a diagram of, like, here's strength, and then what are all the actual physiological and neuromuscular adaptations underneath it, just like the measurements of hypertrophy, you can have a lot of different buckets there. And how deep do we want to go, right?
Yeah.
The broad one that I use when I speak to lifters is there is, neurological adaptations, there's skill, and then there's actual structural adaptations. And the big players in each one of those are things like hypertrophy, which is probably the thrust and the angle we'll take in this podcast. So the actual amount of contractile tissue you have seems to strongly correlate, at least cross-sectionally, with how much force you can produce, which is a very intuitive finding. So, for example, we have studies where we look at elite-level powerlifters, strong men, strong women, high-level weightlifters, and you take either cross-sectional area, lean body mass, or muscle thickness measurements, and you see very strong correlations to their strength and performance. So a large explanatory variable for how much maximal strength do you have is, do you have more muscle mass? Skill, we've kind of already covered. You can alter technique or skill, just perform a movement differently, and that can potentially result in pretty large changes to how much you can lift. And then kind of everything else besides that is what we would put in kind of the neuromuscular bucket.
Right.
And this has to do with, like, increases in rate coding, which is just the frequency at which you can fire muscles, or the motor neuron, which innervates the muscles, or the actual voluntary ability to excite the muscles. So how much just kind of raw electrical activity can you produce? And those adaptations, are actually more complex than that. I'm giving a much more kind of high-level overview. And even within the kind of the structural bucket, yes, hypertrophy is the big one, but there's also the passive force production that you're going to get from the elasticity in tendons, at the whole muscle level. And then intramuscularly, there's the titin molecule, which is kind of at the end of the actin and myosin cross-bridge filaments that connect it to the internal ultrastructure of the muscle fibers that creates almost like an internal tendon, which can produce force when you're doing dynamic contractions, like that have an eccentric and a concentric. So there is, when a muscle produces force, there's both the passive and the active element. And we don't need to go down that rabbit hole too far, but the point is that structural adaptations encompasses a lot of things. There's the angle at which fibers attach to either the tendinous inscription or along the bone longitudinally, and that's called pennation angle, and that can allow more myofibrils to be packed in, so you have more cross-sectional area, but it also reduces the mechanical efficiency for maximal force production, so it's a trade-off. So you can go very, very, very deep on this topic, but I think a useful way of looking at it is there's structural adaptations, skill adaptations, and neuromuscular adaptations.
Yeah, and I love that. It's actually something I quite often go back to in your books, the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, is actually there's this section I've got like screenshotted, and I'll just read it out because it basically just says exactly what you've explained. It's like to optimize strength, you have to train in a specific way to develop all of these three qualities, which is what you just mentioned, like the skill, the neuromuscular adaptations, and then actually the muscle mass structural adaptations. But on the other hand, for hypertrophy, does not require the same degree of specificity in terms of loading. Muscle can grow quite well with both moderate and heavy loading. Taking that and then kind of looking at it from a historical perspective, obviously they didn't have all this data and research to kind of go off when they started training, late 1800s, early 1900s. From your understanding of it, were they kind of ticking the boxes for all of these and kind of being able to combine these strength and hypertrophy elements into a way of lifting that really kind of max it or optimizes both?
Some were, and it wasn't necessarily always the goal to do both. If we go real early and we start thinking about, who were some of the strength performers were basically like vaudeville style circus performers who did one-off expressions of strength. And like other circus performers, they would practice that skill. So they would be very, very good at doing a bent press with a large thing overhead or holding two things. So they absolutely treated it like a skill. And the people who tended to be the strongmen and sometimes strong woman performers, even in the 1800s, were also large, big people. So they had the inherent physical strength. They kind of fit the bill. Remember, this is business. If you think about vaudeville performances, charging tickets, renting out a hall,
right,
and having a spectacle of strength, right? And the names of these performers, like Cyclops,
yeah,
Saxon, Sandow,
yeah,
they the people with some talent, I should say, were those who typically excelled as strong men and women. Volcana on the women's side, Sanduina. So they're big people most of the time. Not necessarily always, though, and there were some interesting things when you looked at the people who were smaller but still very ripped and muscular. But when we talk about these big people, like they were large, they practiced their skill, and they were typically generally fit. They kind of had this kind of baseline level of fitness. They included elements of calisthenics in addition to their lifting, but that was probably less of a focus. Now, when you look at some of the people who were kind of the progenitors of modern bodybuilding, when you think about people who displayed just really impressive physiques, they did a combination of things. So there were sometimes people who were like gymnasts / trapeze artists. So they had a lot of volume of time under tension with bodyweight movements, and they would do these one-off expressions of strength and skill like that. So I think that ties into what we now know from the research at the earliest level, that there's a reasonably strong relationship between the amount of volume of work you do and hypertrophy. Of course, it does have to be at a relatively high effort. And then the strongest relationship for strength is not volume or necessarily effort approximated to failure, but just load. So when you lift heavy, you get really good at the skill of lifting heavy, because barbells move different when they're slow and they feel different. You have to brace differently. You got to move differently. Your position's more important. Your center of pressure changes to a lower degree on heavy loads versus light loads. So there's a skill to lifting heavy, and that's probably the most important thing if you want to look at acute, quick changes in strength. So when we look at the relationship between volume and strength, it's a lot less clear. It's there, but by far the dominant factor for what dictates strength development is, are you lifting heavy enough?
right.
So ultimately, you just need to find a way to combine the two. And when you look at kind of the second and third generation into like the silver era of bodybuilders, after like not the 1800s anymore, but now we're talking like 1920 through 1950 or 60. Weightlifting, and so powerlifting didn't exist yet. That was like mid 60s, but weightlifting was around, and that still included not only the snatch and clean and jerk, but also the clean and press, so like a slow press overhead.
Right.
And many bodybuilding competitions were attached to weightlifting competitions. So like the Mr. America typically happened after weightlifting nationals. So you would have these weightlifters then displaying their physiques. And the training styles kind of developed in concert. So you would see specialization occur more in Europe earlier, but the Americans were because they had this bodybuilding connection, and same with the British, that's kind of where you were seeing this the most. They were doing a lot of reps, a lot of accessory work. The power lifts at the time were called the odd lifts, squat, bench, and deadlift. They were used as accessory movements for weightlifting. And then eventually they became their own sport. But you had people doing, sets of 5, training kind of full body or upper lower with all these the odd lifts and other free weight accessory movements, in addition to practicing the skill of the snatch, clean and jerk, and clean and press. So the combination of those factors led to strong, big, muscular people. So, for example, one of the most legendary weightlifters of all time in the States, Tommy Kono, who held world records and won world championships across multiple weight classes, was also a Mr. Universe. So not uncommon at all, John Grimmick, who was the famous Mr. America, who they made the John Grimmick rule for after, colloquially called that. After he won the Mr. America for the second time in a row, they said, look, you can only win the Mr. America once from now on because, John, you're dominating too much.
Oh, God.
He actually went to the 1936 Olympics as a weightlifter. So, so it was incredibly common at that time to be performing at the highest level of both sports. Not all of them were, but I think if you were to ask me that same question back in that era, people would look at you funny. They would say, if you're strong, you're going to be big. Like, they're inseparable. They saw the form and function as two sides of the same coin, rather than two separate pathways of training or sport. Yeah. So it's the historical perspective, I think, is interesting. It doesn't tell you everything, but it does tell you about what's possible.
Yeah, I guess nowadays there's this kind of differentiation between the two, because you see high-level bodybuilders doing slightly different training than, say, a powerlifter would be doing. But then on the other end of the spectrum, I work with generally general population clients, and they come in, or they'll either do an online consult, or whether it's in the gym, and they come in and they say, I want to get strong. And I'm always kind of like, okay, but like, what does that actually mean for you? Like, what does strong mean? Because, to me, that probably means, okay, we're going to do lots of under 5s, and we're going to do our main barbell lifts, and we're going to get really strong in these movements, because I look at strength as more like a specific skill. But they just probably mean I want to be overall stronger in everything that I do, and I want to build some muscle mass. And that's generally what they're going to mean. But I'm also aware, for our listeners right now, they're probably like, okay, well, we understand that there's some differences between, strength, a little more specific, there's skill, there's neuromuscular adaptations, and there's muscle mass. For muscle building, for hypertrophy, it's a little less, it doesn't have to be as specific as that. But from an actual programming perspective, what are the differences within a training session? We've alluded to already that to get strong, people are generally going to be lifting heavier loads. What does that mean from, say, a rep range perspective, and things like that, in comparison to if someone was purely I just want to get jacked?
Great question. So I think from a strength perspective, when we start to look at some of the relationships where we see faster accumulation of strength with different programming variables, the load on the bar makes a big difference. It makes more of a difference the more experienced you are. So we have data showing that simply lifting heavier than 60% of 1RM, which is something you could do for 25 reps if you're in decent shape, is pretty sufficient to maximize strength gains in untrained lifters. When you think about it, an untrained lifter, they don't even know their 1RM until you test them.
That's right.
So that means their warm-up sets to the 1RM are the heaviest thing they've ever lifted in their life, right?
Yeah.
So, it takes very little, because your adaptation rate and the threshold for what is a sufficient stimulus to adapt is going to be based upon what you've previously done. So if the heaviest squat you've done is your body weight off the toilet, then putting a barbell on your back and squatting is heavier than you ever squatted. Yeah. Then putting weight on that barbell is also heavier, right? So
everything is causing adaptation, from the warm-ups to the, everything's going to be,
So the distinction for a novice between 60 or 80% of 1RM is probably inconsequential. Yeah. When you start to look at trained lifters, though, you see a slightly different story, and you start to see around 80% of 1RM is actually superior to lighter weights. Now it needs to be sufficiently specific to the maximal strength adaptation you're trying to get to really produce an adaptation. And that's not to say that sets of 5 with 75% do nothing.
Mm.
It's just, it scales, right? With specificity. And so essentially, a general rule of thumb is that you want to be training in the 1 to 6 rep range with a moderate proximity to failure. You know, you don't have to be doing your 6 RM when you're doing 6. That could be maybe your 10 RM. You know, you're leaving 4 reps in reserve, if you will, and accumulating multiple sets. You're pushing hard. You should see the barbell actually slowing down to some degree. That's an indication that you're producing maximal force and then incurring some fatigue.
Mm.
And there should also be some heavy work where you are doing maybe a single rep at a pretty high level of effort, where maybe you couldn't do a second rep, or you could do 1 more rep, or maybe 2 more reps at most. And that should be sprinkled in and probably placed at a point when you're going to be actually testing your strength. So that is kind of like your specificity increasing. So that's why strength training, people will generally talk about it. It's like, you know, your 5x5 or your 3x3, or you do a single and back off work.
Mm.
And those are all perfectly acceptable. And we don't have clear reason to believe that one is superior to another. And it's also true that every strength athlete you'll meet, not every, but most strength athletes you'll meet and most coaches will also have accessory work. Because the downside of only having a set that lasts 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 reps is that it is not a sufficient amount of time to really be accumulating enough volume and fatigue to potentially put those muscle fibers under high degrees of tension and stress that are going to produce maximal hypertrophy. And we'll get into this in a second, but there's also a cost at trying to use your strength movements that are often multi-joint complex, free weight lifts as your primary vehicle for hypertrophy. You absolutely can do it. And that's how the Silver Age guys did it, right? Barbell rows, bench press, overhead press, snatch, all that good stuff. But when you look at the accessory movements modern powerlifters do, there are things like, dumbbell chest press, cable row, that pull down, a reverse hyper, a belt squat. They are inherently easier exercises that take less mental and physical toll on the body. And they are easier to accumulate volume on. And they are easier and have less fatigue consequences to go closer to failure on. When we look at what are the things that cause hypertrophy, the load is much less consequential, like you were alluding to from my books. It's really more about the effort and the total amount of work. So if you're close enough to failure and you're doing enough total work, you're going to see hypertrophy occur in the muscle you've trained. So they can absolutely overlap. Like one of the most famous programs is the 5x5. You're doing 5 sets of 5. Each individual set of 5 is probably like slightly less effective than the set of 8 to 10, maybe. But it's low enough in terms of the number of reps that the load is high enough to stimulate an adaptation, but it's high enough reps, and if you do it the way it's typically prescribed, close enough to failure, maybe that last set of 5 and that 5x5 is like pretty much at a max, that you're getting kind of the best of both worlds. Now, it's also hard. Like if you were to go in and do a hard set of 5x5 on squats and deadlifts, there's not a whole lot else that you're going to be good for in that session. But I think that's perfectly acceptable and totally fine, especially for intermediates and lower, because you can only incur so much stress while you're still building your strength. And like I said, you have a low threshold for adaptation. So you don't need to specialize very much to get the most out of your body. And you can kind of take that quote unquote power builder approach to where you can get the best of both worlds. And yeah, like if you're Chris Bumstead or Russell Orhe, it's a different ball game. You're trying to be literally the best in the world, and everything has an opportunity cost because you've already built yourself up way past the intermediate phase. And you're thinking, look, where do I go from here? And for every gimme, there's a gotcha. So you might be thinking, look, I don't want to spend my time accumulating volume on a bench press or a squat or a deadlift. I'm going to do maybe some of that, but I can get a lot more work done and spend more time and effort with less fatigue cost if I'm doing things like a machine or a plate-loaded thing or a dumbbell or a cable, etc. And opposite for a powerlifter, I only have so much time for these accessories. I need to maybe spend more time practicing the specific lifts, or depending on whatever I think my deficit is in those buckets for strength. So it becomes much more individualized at a high level, and there's concessions that they're unwilling to make. But that's just not really relevant to your average trainee, who can very easily have their cake and eat it too if that's, hypertrophy and strength.
Yeah. Here's a question for you, Eric. I mean, I'm going to keep circling back to these 3 components of strength: the neuromuscular, the structural adaptations, so the muscle growth, and the skill acquisition. In regards to the muscle growth aspect, So you alluded to before, a lot of these powerlifters will do, you know, ones, threes, fives, and that'll be their strength work. And then they might do some accessory work. They might do some flies, etc. Right? So build some muscle mass. How important is that component? So of those three sort of categories, how important is the structural adaptations to continue to, I guess, see progression in the strength? Because what if someone just did no accessory work and they were literally just going in there and going, okay, I'm going to do my 5x5, or even like more specific with like a higher intensity, I'm going to go and do my one single and then I'm going to leave. How long would they continue to make progress in strength without including any kind of like bodybuilding, muscle building exercises?
Yeah, probably a long time if they're relatively novice, just
Yeah.
working up to a heavy single. They'd have a lot of runway, and a shorter time period if they're more experienced. And we actually have data on this. So a big shout out to Dr. Pack. If you ever want to look at his research he's published, he did his PhD on the minimum effective training dose to enhance strength in powerlifters specifically. And his name is Patroklos Androulakis Korakakis. You'd be looking for
My God.
an awesome Greek name. You'd be looking for Korakakis as the lead author, or Androulakis Korakakis, excuse me, with a hyphen. But if you just search minimum effective training dose in powerlifters study, this will come up.
Yeah.
And what they did was they compared, among various other training study designs and interviews with powerlifters and coaches, et cetera. One of the cool studies they did was they compared a number of different approaches of varying degrees of what might be the minimum effective training dose. So one group, literally all they did was they came in and they used what's called the 2-3-1 schedule on the squat, bench, deadlift. And that's the frequency at which they would work up to a near max lift, like a 9 to 9.5 RPE. That means they came in and they warmed up and they got up to a squat near max twice a week. So 2 working reps per week on the squat, 3 times on the bench, and then once on the deadlift. So they literally only did a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lifts per week. Wow. Right? Six lifts per week, right?
Yeah.
Out of all 3 lifts.
Yeah, well.
Now, the interesting thing is that group slowly gained strength and then kind of plateaued. And you typically see people's numbers, and then a few other studies, if you kind of coordinate a few different things. These powerlifters, their strength is plateauing somewhere between like 4 to 8 weeks. And they're starting to kind of sputter and stop. Mm. However, there was another group where they did that plus back offsets. So they had the exact same single working up to a single schedule. But then after each one of those sessions, they did 2 sets of 3 at 80% of whatever that single was. And in that group, you saw substantially better gains that continued throughout the 6-week period. Now, it was only a 6-week long study. We don't know if it would have kept continuing in that fashion, but it goes to show that specificity is very powerful. Working up to those singles really does do a lot for that skill and neuromuscular component. And like I said, I think this is an important point. You don't need a ton of volume, but you do need some. And even maybe, some back down triples might be enough to extend that kind of time to peak for a lot longer. And I think if then you layer on top of that, and this is speculation, I don't have data on this, but if we're talking about years of progress and how you set yourself up for success, if you have your singles, your back off work, and then you also have some accessories, because honestly, how long does it take? And like the hardest session is going to be like your squat bench day or your bench deadlift day, and you're going to have a single on each and then 2 sets of 3. So you're going to be out of there in half an hour, right?
Yeah.
So it's like 90 minutes of training per week at most. And then if you were to simply go, right, I'm going to choose, an upper body push, an upper body pull, or a supplementary lower body exercise on each one of those 3 days, and you did, 3x10 at a high proximity to failure, that's literally just 3 additional exercises. I did a lat pull down, I did a dumbbell chest press or an overhead press, and then I did, a belt squat or maybe an RDL or something like that. And that's like the minimalist approach. Just one additional exercise for 3x10. I think that would extend you out way far, longer. You wouldn't see measurable increases in a 6-week or 8-week or 10 or even 12-week study, probably, if I had to guess. But I think it would make the difference to where if you looked at them 3 years from now, there'd be a difference in ceiling. They'd have a different ceiling.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, just regarding like a minimalist approach to training, like what you can get away with. Because I've seen some of the data. I'm pretty sure it was within Mass or it was something else I was reading, where specifically for strength, I think it was something like you get 80% or 60% of the strength gains from like 1 to 4 sets a week. But then for hypertrophy, for muscle growth, it was like, I can't remember the percentages. It was like, yeah, 60 or 80% or whatever, you'll know, um, of the gains from like 6 sets or something per week or per muscle group. And it was like, wow, you can actually, like, it seems like kind of the first set you do of an exercise is kind of like doing most of the work for you. And then the rest of it is kind of just adding little bits, but it's like, well, it's probably also adding a lot of fatigue as well. So again, then it comes into like, programming strategies and all that. But I guess, yeah, it does seem like you can just get away with a lot less probably than a lot of people are aware of. But you'll know the stats better than I do, Eric.
No, you represented them well. So if on the hypertrophy side, you get roughly 2/3 of the gains, and this is not, when I say you get, it's an important point to the listener that your mileage may vary. You're not the result of a meta-analysis.
Yeah.
You may have a very different experience, but when we look at like a population average, if I had to, if I had to go to Vegas and bet, like what would I expect?
Yeah.
How much more hypertrophy would the average resistance training participant out of thousands get if they did X or Y or Z? This is what would probably occur and what I'd bet on. The first 1 to 4 sets is going to produce about 2/3 of the hypertrophy you'd expect over a typical study length period. And you get up into the mid 80s when you move from there to like 5 to 9, and then when you're in the 10 plus range, you're getting the highest values you see when you're looking at those three ranges, right?
Yeah.
However, for strength, and that kind of makes sense. Like if you asked a bodybuilder if they'd want to get only 2/3 of their gains, like a third's not negligible, right?
That's true.
And that's why, like I said, the relationship between hypertrophy is clearer. But for strength, it's not until like the 1 to 4 set range gets you, like you said, about 80% of the gains you get, and you're like, wow, and then you're doing 5 to 12, and you're getting just another. Actually, I think it's 19% more, like 81% if I recall correctly. So it just goes to show you how much of the early skill practice and neuromuscular adaptations come from just those initial hard sets, assuming they're sufficiently heavy. So then the question is not what's optimal. The question is what's appropriate for the goal and the person you're talking to. If you have your coach's hat on, and if you've got someone who's interested in being stronger, interested in changing their body, and they have 2 hours a week to give you as a trainer, you can make some decisions as to what's the best bang for my buck, and what kind of promises can I make to this person, and what can we expect, and how do I judge the efficacy of the work I'm doing with them. When previously, if you kind of looked at the way the evidence-based community was doing things, there was almost always the assumption that you wanted optimal. So you feel like if I wasn't doing at least 10 sets per muscle group, I'm doing a disservice. I'm not being evidence-based.
Yeah.
But that's not true. What's your goal? If someone says, I'm busy, I have a family, I don't have much time to give to this, and I'm motivated to do this, but it's not my entire life goal to be jacked or as humanly strong as possible, then you go, sweet, let's get you in here, twice a week and spend, 45 minutes training and 15 minutes talking, nutrition, life, mentality, all the other things that we do as trainers. And you can get a robust stimulus in there for both adaptations with a minimalist approach that you might previously thought, oh, this isn't enough. And it's only not enough if the goal is to maximize the adaptation that person can get over time. And that's a question that, as a coach, you'd ask somebody if they were a competitive bodybuilder or a competitive strength athlete, because that poor return on investment is worth it. If a powerlifter's goal isn't to see how much they can lift if they spend the minimum amount of time to get stronger in the gym, it's to be as strong as possible and beat other people. So they're willing to spend, an additional 2 hours in the gym for only a 1 or 2 or 3% return on investment. So long as it doesn't actually, like you said, the fatigue or the injury risk doesn't outweigh that. And that's the gambit that powerlifters play is how far can I push the envelope in terms of specific training and the high volume of training before I actually get a negative return on investment. There is an injury risk, which is something to consider kind of on the other end of that bell curve. But that's an unfortunate one where you take a motivated athlete who has a strong incentive, incredibly strong willpower, and an unknown point at which it becomes a negative until you actually run up against it. to where that's, the savvy coach has to kind of pull them back and be a little more conservative. But that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother podcast. But the point is 100% right. A minimalist approach is still getting you the largest proportion of your gains, which doesn't seem to line up with what we often think. And to maximize your adaptations, yeah, it takes more volume. Yeah, you have to do more work, but it's not that much more than if you were taking a more minimalist approach.
It's actually really encouraging for, people just to understand those points of like, it's not all or nothing. Like it kind of like it is a spectrum. Like if I'm working with a client, often I'll have to adjust their programs when they're going through busier periods of their lives. And we go, okay, cool. Look, I'm gonna do 3 workouts a week, but they're gonna be short. They're gonna be like 40 minutes, 45. And we're going to utilize some supersets. We're going to utilize some, some top sets, some back off sets, but we're really just focused on quite low volume training and high proximity to failure. And I'm like, look, you're actually going to get most of your results from this. And they're like, really? And I'm like, I had the same perspective in the past as well. Like if I'm not doing all of it, then I'm kind of wasting my time. But it's kind of like when I look at like the topic of like protein dosaging, right? It's like, it's not that like 1.5 grams per kilo is not going to allow you to grow muscle when we know like, okay, 1.6 grams per kilo is potentially more optimal. It's like, it's not like, it is a spectrum. It is like almost a dimmer switch. And you can have periods where, you're turning that dimmer down a little bit and you're not, training optimally or eating like the optimal spectrum of protein. You can have those periods and still actually see progression. And I think it kind of just allows people to maybe relax a little bit and go, I don't have to be all in all the time. And I can still make this a part of my lifestyle and enjoy training and see progression, even though I'm not doing what, this bodybuilder said or whatever.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent way of kind of framing it. So I totally agree, Jackson.
Yeah.
And psychologically, I think the minimum effective dose can be quite appropriate and useful, and it has utility compared to the all or nothing approach when someone is busy. So
yeah.
Let's say you have someone with a life, with kids, with a job, with pressures, people in responsibilities, but they're very serious about their strength goals. That can create friction in their lives when their life is doing something that doesn't enable them to put as much as they would like to into their strength training. And you've probably coached people in this situation. You might have even been in it yourself. It can be very psychologically helpful to shift from, man, I can't do it. Because, when that happens, when you think you can't do it, you either make one of two decisions, which are both poor. You just let it fall away completely and you just focus on all that other stuff because I can't be in and it's poorly motivated. It's like, why should I do it at all? Or you force that, square peg into that round hole and something else suffers, whether it's your mental health, your physical health, your time, your relationships, your sleep, whatever. You're getting the same training in, even though you really don't have the time and energy for it. Because you think you have to if you want to maintain the same rate of progress or the gains you've got. And if you actually shifted to going, well, you know what? Wouldn't it be pretty cool to just not regress? For me to hit pause on my strength during this really stressful summer or whatever period of time it was, and just come in and do like some heavy singles and then leave. And then it really wouldn't impede on my life. And I would know that, compared that to what those other two options you would have had with your previous psychological disposition, you do regress because you do nothing. And then you come back to the gym and it's hard to get back into it. You've had this lapse, you're weaker. You feel like you're a diminished version of your old self, and it's hard to even get back. And sometimes people never do because of the psychological component. Or you get hurt, or you sacrifice things or you burned out, so you don't want to anymore, or you feel guilty about doing it because it's created all this stress in your life, right? But if you can just go in there and hit pause, or maybe even make a little bit of progress, like I said, like it doesn't take much. But even let's say worst case scenario, you just come in and you do one single once per week on the lifts you care about. You can functionally hit pause on your strength. And then, realistically, like psychologically, you're super, super busy, got all this other stuff going on. Your focus is going to be there anyway. And it's just good to know. And it's kind of this safety blanket that you have of going, all right, so I'm not going to lose any strength. I can focus on this other aspect of my life. And then when I come back to it, I'm right where I was last time and I can move forward. So I think that is a different psychological and very functional psychological perspective to have for people when they go through these periods. And it is something that is very useful because it prevents relapses, it prevents people quitting, it prevents burnout. And it's an option that a lot of the times people just don't consider because of the way we kind of sell, you're all in, kind of a mentality.
Absolutely. No, I 100% agree. And it's just changing that perspective. It's allowing people to look at it from a different viewpoint and, make this whole thing a bit more of a lifestyle. It's like with the new gym I'm building, it's group training, but the whole goal is to get more people lifting. You know what I mean? Because I'm aware that majority of people don't want to go into the gym and do a bodybuilding workout, but they do want to get fit. They do want to lift some weights. They want the benefits, the health benefits from those, longevity benefits, bone mineral density benefits. They want to look a little better. Well, I can put them in a group training setting and take them through structured resistance training, with periodization models and good proximity to failure, all that good stuff, coach them properly in a group setting, and it's not going to impede on their life. They're going to go in there 3 days a week. They're going to do an hour of training, and they get the community benefits from it as well. And it's like, it's not optimal. Like, it's not going to be perfect for muscle gain or strength gain, but it's going to get the most of the way there. And that's really the ultimate goal for me in that situation. But I did the big question I'm dying to ask you, Eric, and to cover here is just circling back and utilizing like phases of training. So whether you see there's benefit in utilizing a phase of muscle gain training, so like purely hypertrophy, and then having a phase of purely like strength, or doing multiple phases of hypertrophy and then a strength phase. Like, is there, and I've looked at some of the stuff you guys have put out in terms of the research around this, and I haven't ever really come to a decent conclusion in my mind, so I'm hoping you can like sort that out for me. But I guess, does having a hypertrophy cycle like potentiate more strength, and vice versa? Do you, having a strength cycle getting really strong, does that allow you to produce more hypertrophy in future cycles?
The answer is maybe.
God damn it, Eric, give me a solid answer.
Well, if I tell you what, there isn't a solid answer in the research community, and there's robust debate around that because we don't have the solid research to back it up. And we have theoretical reason to say it probably does, and I'll say what it is in a second. But it's very difficult to say, hey, let's take a bunch of strength athletes and train them over a 2-year period. And in one group, we'll just kind of have them always training for strength and hypertrophy simultaneously. And the other group will have this phasic approach to see if there's this potentiation effect of having subsequent blocks of, your typical periodization structure. We'll go hypertrophy, strength, power, right? Or something like that. Or even if we're just power lifters, which ironically don't care about power, they care about strength. We can just go hypertrophy, strength, hypertrophy, strength, hypertrophy, strength, right?
Yeah.
Now, to basically answer your question, I do essentially program hypertrophy and strength blocks for powerlifters. And that tells you something. That means that there's enough evidence for me to believe that any downside of doing that is worth the potential theoretical upside. But with that said, I still include some elements to smooth over the transitions. So when you look at periodization theory, undulating forms of periodization, block forms of periodization, they've all been created to not see, or to reduce the possibility of losing the adaptation from a prior block that's very different. Like if you look at your kind of original long-term periodization format, you might spend months doing like an aerobic base, and then months doing muscular endurance, and then months doing hypertrophy, then months doing strength, and months doing, power before you finally peak at this one massive competition. But what we know from data is that there is a loss of these prior adaptations if you're not doing any specific training for that quality after a certain amount of time.
Right.
Some type of training can preserve others. Like if you build an aerobic base and you do a bunch of anaerobic training, like let's say you start running 5 miles and you get your 5 mile time down, you get your general conditioning up, and then you decide to run 400 meter sprints or less, you're probably going to maintain the majority of that aerobic base. But it depends on how much you're trying to maintain. Like you can't take an elite level marathon runner and have them start running sprints and then maintain that marathon fitness. Likewise, you could say the same things about some of the resistance training adaptations, right? So for example, when I run successive hypertrophy and strength blocks, I do still have some singles in the hypertrophy block, So if I have a power lifter who's going to have a squat day and it's a volume focus, they might work up to a single at like a 6 or a 7 RPE. And then the back off work would be, sets of 5 to 6 or something like that. But then in the strength block, it might be a single at like an 8 RPE and then back off triples,
Right.
and then there would be far more accessory work during the volume block, and there would be less accessory work and more specific work, a higher frequency of those singles. If I'm only hitting each single once per week during that volume block far from competition, it might be more like that 2-3-1 setup, or even more frequent when they're closer to competition.
Right.
And that can be a spectrum. It can be phased in and out, so that the total amount of time spent on that specific work during a volume block 4 months away from a competition might only be 15 minutes a week, but it might be the majority of the program when we're close,
Yeah.
So ultimately, we know that more muscle mass, more contractile tissue should produce more force. It does cross-sectionally, but we don't see it over the short-term period because it takes longer for that to actually make a sufficient difference and to overshadow, other aspects of strength, which have a much more immediate effect, like practicing the skill. So theoretically, there's a solid understanding of, we need to get bigger over time. So we got to do this work, but your performance 2 weeks from now on the powerlifting platform is not dependent on whether you did rows 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes, it should summate. It should potentiate. It should be successive. If you can produce more force and you do velocity-specific training, you'd think you'd be able to generate more power, because power is force times velocity, right? It seems logical, right? And if, power is force times velocity, and force is heavily influenced by how much muscle mass you have, then okay, it makes sense to have hypertrophy training before my strength training, before my power training, for a general sports science perspective. But I wouldn't bet the farm on it so much without empirical support that I'm setting it up in such a way that could be making other concessions, to where during that power training block, I'm doing no hypertrophy training. Or I've got a pure power athlete that doesn't need a ton of hypertrophy, but I want to enhance their power. I'm not going to invest a huge amount of time in hypertrophy, right? So, there's differences. Like a javelin thrower is not exactly the same thing as a power lifter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying a javelin thrower shouldn't do any hypertrophy work, but the heaviest object they're ever going to try to move as fast as they can is the javelin. And the whether it's more force or velocity dominant is on a spectrum, and it's much more velocity dominant compared to powerlifting, which is always the heaviest thing you can lift once. So it's always going to move slow.
Yeah.
So for a power lifter, hypertrophy probably much more important than for a more power dominant athlete, which I think is, that doesn't sound right with the name of powerlifting. But
it doesn't.
No, but the theoretical, even though I don't have a ton of empirical support, rationale for doing hypertrophy work for a power lifter is very strong. Doing it for other athletes, it's there, but I wouldn't do it if there was a sufficient opportunity cost to where they couldn't do skill work, anaerobic training, power training, strength training.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think probably for most people listening, they'll generally want to have like a bit of best of both worlds, I would say.
Yeah.
But then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people obviously that have like pure physique goals. And I think for those individuals, I guess it all comes down to like fatigue management, because, if their goal is pure physique improvements, so pure muscle mass, then maybe spending lots of time doing, heavy fives on a squat is going to cause a lot of fatigue. And they potentially don't really need the skill improvements from doing that, because it's like, well, I'm not going to be performing that lift for any reason. It's like, well, what is the exercise that's going to give me, I guess, the most bang for my buck from a stimulus perspective and not cause me heaps of fatigue? So would you say that's a correct assessment in the terms of like, if someone was purely just going for muscle gain, there's no real need, or there's no need to really perform these more, I guess, like quote unquote strength lifts, because the goal is just to provide sufficient stimulus?
Yeah, it's not a requisite. I think the one thing that people who have pure physique focuses should borrow from the strength world is progressive overload, because that doesn't change. And it doesn't mean you have to get progressively heavier all the time, but the sufficient effort component should not be ignored. It's not just volume, right? So that means whether you're preferring to do sets of 6 on squats, and that is the vehicle you want to use, or you want to do sets of 12 on a leg press, ultimately that set of 12 needs to be at a pretty close proximity to failure. And you will get stronger. If you're not getting stronger at all over time, if there is this relationship that we think there is, where more contractile tissue equals more force, then are you adding more contractile tissue? If you look in your logbook from 4, 5, 6 months ago, and your 12 RM on leg press is exactly the same, I bet your quads don't look that much different if I had to place money. So you should be seeing that even if you're training in the 8 to 12 rep range on a machine, that the loads are going up, right? Or the loads are staying the same, but your proximity to failure is getting lower. Like it's getting easier, and then you have to increase the load. So that might be, an intermediate. It takes longer before you actually materialize those, more plates on the bar. But ultimately, your performance is the best indicator we have of changes in hypertrophy in the interim before it becomes visually obvious, or if you have the fortune of being able to, jump in some type of, if you come down to AUT and I ultrasound you.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I'm not offering.
Yeah, I was going to say, hey, what?
You're not allowed to do that. No, don't do that. Don't ask. Ain't nobody got time for that. Unless you want to participate in one of our studies when we have.
Yeah, there you go.
Which you know about. Yeah. But seriously, I think the way to view this is it takes a long time for drug-free athletes to materialize changes in muscle mass that are visually accessible after the novice and intermediate stage. So what you need to be chasing is the logbook. So that's one thing even a pure physique-focused lifter will share with the powerlifter or the strength athlete who is focused on just trying to move those numbers as well. But they have movement constraints. They have repetition constraints that you don't have.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely something I focus on so much with clients is helping them to understand the different progression methods we might use just so that they go, and we actually get them to track all their lifts, just so they go, okay, the goal still is to see some changes over time in terms of like number of reps we do or strength on a particular lift, or I should say load on a particular lift. But also probably one of the biggest things I do focus on is kind of getting them to the point where they understand proximity to failure. They understand like, well, how hard should I be training here? Because if that's not in place, like as you've already kind of alluded to, those initial novice gains, sure, they can probably train pretty far from fail and get adaptations. But it's like after those newbie gains are gone, we have to be hitting some pretty hard sets here. And I think, most people are just not there. So it's my job to kind of try to get that level up a little bit. But then, even you saying, that talking about the leg press, and then, if you haven't seen your numbers go up, you're probably not growing any muscle there. Like that hits at home for me as well, because I've literally just started a cycle where I'm doing leg press again, which I haven't done for a long time. But I'm standardizing the technique as much as I can. So the range of motion for me now is like seat all the way back. It's coming down until I hit the stopper, so there's no more depth in it. With full range of motion, I'm actually going to pause at the bottom, so there's no kind of bounce. And my loads have gone way down, but that is the new standard. You know what I mean? So now I can see those progressions from there and go, okay, wow, I did 160 for 6. Well, by the end of the cycle, am I doing 160 for 8 or am I doing 170 for 6? Is there that tangible progression there? And then, like you said, there will hopefully be some muscle growth as a result, of course, if other things are in line, nutrition, protein, sleep, etc.
Well said. No, that's exactly it. And sometimes you will make different alterations to the exercise execution when your goal is physique oriented. Like you'll do things that'll actually make it harder. You'll pause in a lengthened position. You might slow the eccentric a little more. You might go, I don't need to wear a belt. I don't need that.
Right.
And your absolute loads will come down, but then from there you need to see it progress.
Yeah.
While a power lifter will go, well, I think I could pull more sumo, or I'm going to take a wider grip on my bench press to reduce the range of motion to make this easier so I can lift a higher absolute load.
Yeah.
So, but then once you've set your technique that's appropriate for the goal you're trying to achieve, then in both cases, you should see those numbers rise over time, or at least the reps you can do if you're a bodybuilder, et cetera.
So to wrap this thing up, Eric, I'd love to provide like a practical kind of summary to everybody listening and basically say like, well, I guess the majority of people do want to get most, optimize strength, and they want to optimize muscle growth at the same time. How does that look for most people in terms of like how they actually train? Maybe we could just provide some like kind of practical take homes of maybe how they would structure a session.
Absolutely. So you want to start with the movement that you actually want to get strongest on. You have your skills of strength, if you will. So let's just say for you, that's an overhead press and a deadlift. And that's what you care about. You would start your sessions off with an overhead press or a deadlift. And depending upon how you were structuring your training, how fatigued and how good you felt on that day, you're probably working up to kind of like your benchmark set that tells you, to some degree, it's a monitoring tool. Am I stronger or not? But it's also a training tool. It's making you better at the skill of the lift. So that could be working up to a triple, a double, or a single, anywhere from say like a 6 to even a 10 RPE if you've got a spotter and that's, kind of the end of the training cycle or whatever.
Right.
After that, you would probably do some back down sets to practice the lift and to get some volume on that lift. One thing about doing volume with the main lifts, even though it might be higher fatigue, is that it will be specific to the muscles that are being used in the lift because it's the lift. But that doesn't necessarily need to be sets of 10 or 10 by 10 or anything like that. But I would say a couple of sets of anywhere from 2 to 5, depending on what your preference is. And then from there, you would spend some additional time training your overall general kind of bodybuilding work with the time you had available and the muscle groups which are most likely to contribute to that lift and the other ones, considering the fatigue you just had off those top sets. So, in the same kind of vein, you do the same thing with the deadlift. So you might have like your upper body day that's all there to support the overhead press, and you'd have your kind of lower body back day to support that deadlift in this random example I've given. And over time, you can just make those top sets a little heavier, a little lower rep. The back off sets, same kind of thing, but still staying short of failure. And then you just kind of keep the same kind of pattern with the accessory work. Like I'm just trying to, like you were saying, hopefully I'm doing, 170 for 6 or 160 for 8, even though I started at 160 for 8. So they kind of operate on like their own little progression scheme. And really you're not worried about the progression rate. You're letting it come to you. You're just pushing those chips up when your body allows it, grabbing another rep here and there, adding another 2.5 to either side of the bar or another stack on the plate. While the main lifts, you're kind of going through this process of, heavier singles over time, additional back off work. And that's kind of the general way, that I would structure it if your goal is primarily strength. Then you kind of have all those aspects of strength supported in that training model.
Yeah. And is there some elements of that you're utilizing yourself, I guess, going into this year with these kind of two very different sports that you're lining up for?
Exactly. Yes. So I plan on doing North Islands if my body holds up while I'm getting leaner and leaner in June, and I'll need to be at 83 by then. So I probably want to be around 85 and then cut. Currently at 88. So I'm on track for that water cut. And I am definitely trying to get my WNBF Pro card and compete at Worlds. So my primary goal is bodybuilding, right?
Yeah.
So I have like this bodybuilding base of this. Like this is the stuff I've got to do, I know, to preserve muscle and maybe even build a little bit early on. And, based upon my weak points and my strong points in my physique. And then, all right, I've bolted on kind of that 2-3-1 approach. So I am doing a day where I do some heavy hack squats or leg press. And I'm also doing a day where I work up to a single on squat and I do two back off sets. I have 1 day per week where I work up to a heavy single on deadlift, do back off sets. And that's before I do my bodybuilding work.
Right.
And then I have 1 day where I do close grip bench, 1 day where I do regular bench. And then I have another day where I do like either dips or dumbbell presses.
Okay.
And on the close grip bench day and the bench day, I do work up to a heavy set and do back off sets.
Right.
So I've integrated that minimum effective training dose approach into my training. And that's working so far. Right before I went on this recent trip to Europe, I hit a 200 squat, a 145 bench, and a 227 deadlift, which is not nearly at my peak.
Right.
But for the last year or 2 years, I've been training almost exclusively for bodybuilding. So seeing those numbers kind of coming back up to there, I'm going to milk that as long as I can. And considering that those numbers are going up while my body weight's going down, I'd say it's a pretty good thing, even though I'm not near my PRs. Or we're not that near my PRs yet.
Yeah, that's insane. No, that's really cool. Yeah, okay. I think we've pretty much covered everything, Eric. Really, really good. Let me hit you with a final question.
Yes, sir.
Which is basically just a random recommendation. So anything that you've been digging lately, maybe it's like a book you've been into, a Netflix show, outdoor activity, music, whatever it may be. What have you been digging lately that maybe the listeners would be interested in as well?
Yeah, man. I have been listening to a lot of King of the Lifts podcasts. So if you are someone who's interested in getting more into the sport of powerlifting, Ryan Lapidat does a very good job of interviewing all like the big movers and shakers and chasing the interesting intrigue that's going on, reporting on the Sheffield. And that's probably the personal interest and focus I've had because I just coached there.
Yeah, cool.
But since you were mentioning earlier, hey, we're getting to this point where people might be interested in powerlifting as a spectator sport.
Right.
That's the show to get the insider look. It is definitely like the Powerlifters Powerlifting podcast. You might have like a 3-hour interview with someone you've never even heard of.
Yeah.
But if you look for like the recap shows specifically, or the preview shows for Worlds, Sheffield, or Nationals, those would be good to watch, and then watch the actual stream of the competition, and then you'll have a connection to those athletes. You'll know what to expect. You'll know where the battles are, and it might be a little more interesting.
Yeah, it's seeing like the individual stories of an athlete, and then actually feeling like you want to see them succeed because you kind of know a little bit about them. You know what I mean? It's like when I watch like a little bit of UFC, when I know the fighters, then the fights become so much more exciting. So that makes a lot of sense, man. So thanks for that recommendation. And thanks for your time, Eric. Really, really good. It was a great discussion. And yeah, I think people will take a lot away from this one. Hopefully it didn't go too far over people's heads. I think we gave you gave a very nice summary there. And it will be of a lot of use. Now, do you want to quickly just plug away, let people know where they can find your stuff or anything specific you want to shout out and sell while you're here?
Absolutely. That's why we're here in the end, is for you to listen to my 20-second
sales
commercial
pitch
at the end of this spot. That's right. No, first, seriously, though, Jackson, I appreciate you having me on. You did a great job hosting that, and you took me down some great directions where I think we did paint a very useful picture to the listener that wasn't too high level or too low level. Yeah. So I hope we did a good job. Hopefully the comments reflect that. As far as where you can find more information from me, if you want to keep learning, check out 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, followed by musclejourney.com. And that is my website where we have resources for the natural lifter, coaching, blog articles, links to our YouTube. You can find out about the team. We have coaching, and each one of us has an Instagram with educational stuff. And from there, you can also find links to my book, which Jackson, you sort of generously referenced, where you can really kind of become a student of lifting, both the nutrition and training related to it. The muscle and strength pyramids. And also, if you really want to nerd out, and Jackson, you also mentioned this offhand, if you want to stay up to date with the research as it's coming out on a monthly basis, you can subscribe to MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, which is a monthly research review that myself, Dr. Eric Trexler, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Lauren Colenso-Semple put out on a monthly basis. So, those are the only things I'd suggest. And if you just love the culture of lifting, then definitely subscribe to my podcast, Omar Isuf, Iron Culture.
Beautifully done, man. Thanks so much, Eric.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, there you go. Massive episode. I hope you took away some good practical insights that you can actually implement. If you've got any more questions around strength versus hypertrophy, be sure to let me know, or of course, hit the doc up himself. I'm sure he'd love to help you out. And before you get out of here, real quick plug, the Vegan Fitness mini course is still available online. You can jump on that one for a super low price and gain a stack of information. There's been a lot of people signing up to that one recently, which has been really exciting. And I know there's a lot of value in that for anyone who wants to really optimize their body composition on a vegan diet. So we cover the basics of calorie balance, we cover protein intake, we cover your training. So lots of the things we talked about today's episode in regards to progression. And we also cover nutrition for health. What kind of foods you need to be eating to optimize your health on a vegan diet. Finally, the last presentation of this course is your supplementation. What supplements are decent to have in place? What are a waste of time? So if that's of interest to you, be sure to check out the link for the Vegan Fitness mini course. There we go, team. Episode 48 done and dusted. We're creeping up on the episode 50 and the finale of season 3. That's it from me. Catch you in the next one.